prominent civil rights attorney, taking a rare break from her grueling schedule. A thick hardcover novel rested in her lap as she immersed herself in its pages. Her moment of tranquility shattered when the sharp screech of tires cut through the park's ambient hum. A police cruiser rolled to a stop at the curb, drawing curious glances from passers-by. Two officers stepped out, their expressions taut with authority. They scanned the area, their eyes locking onto Adrienne, the only solitary figure in the vicinity. "Ma'am," called one officer, his tone heavy with suspicion. "May we have a word?" Adrienne looked up, startled but composed. "Of course," she replied, closing her book carefully. The second officer approached briskly. "We received reports of suspicious activity in the area. Mind telling us what you're doing here?" Adrienne raised a brow, confusion plain on her face. "Suspicious activity? I'm sitting here reading a book," she said, holding it up as evidence. The officer's scrutiny didn't waver. "Can we see some ID?" Adrienne's pulse quickened, but her calm demeanor remained intact. "I don't understand. What exactly am I being accused of?" "It's routine," the first officer said, though his tone was anything but reassuring. By now, a small crowd had begun to gather. People exchanged murmurs, their unease palpable. Adrienne sighed, reached into her bag, and handed over her ID. The officer studied it with unnecessary intensity. "Adrienne Clark," he read aloud, his tone almost mocking. "What's your business here, Miss Clark?" Adrienne inhaled deeply, her patience thinning. "I live in this city. I came here to enjoy the park. Is that a problem?" The officer's lips curled into a tight smirk. "We'll see," he said, handing back her ID. But instead of leaving, they lingered, asking invasive questions that felt more like an interrogation. "Do you always carry a book like that?" one officer sneered. "Are you waiting for someone, or are you alone?" The other pressed, his hand resting conspicuously on his belt. Adrienne had handled countless tense situations in courtrooms, but this was different. The power imbalance was stark, the tone unnerving. Still, she stood her ground. "I'm not answering any more questions unless you tell me what I'm being accused of," she said firmly. Her defiance seemed to provoke them. The first officer grabbed her arm. "You're resisting," he barked, despite Adrienne not moving an inch. "What are you doing?" she exclaimed, startled. The murmurs from the crowd grew louder, and several people pulled out their phones to record the encounter. "Stop resisting," the officer repeated, louder this time, as though addressing the onlookers rather than Adrienne herself. Humiliation and frustration burned in Adrienne's chest as the handcuffs clicked around her wrists. Led toward the cruiser, she caught the eye of a young woman recording the scene. Their gazes met, and Adrienne silently pleaded for her to document what was happening. Inside the cramped back seat of the cruiser, Adrienne's mind raced. Years of defending clients and advocating for justice had not prepared her for this. At the station, the humiliation continued. Fingerprinting, photographs, and a holding cell with buzzing fluorescent lights. Hours later, she was released on bail. Adrienne's friend and colleague Naomi was waiting outside. "What happened?" Naomi asked, concern etched on her face. Adrienne shook her head, her voice steady despite her exhaustion. "I'm not letting this slide, Naomi. Not this time. The battle begins." Adrienne wasted no time. That night, she began drafting a civil rights lawsuit against the officers in the department. The next day, the video of her arrest, posted by the young woman in the park, went viral. Messages of support poured in, along with stories of others who had suffered similar injustices. The legal battle was arduous. The police department, unsurprisingly, filed a motion to dismiss the case. Adrienne's team anticipated this and doubled down, preparing a robust counter-argument. Meanwhile, Adrienne's community engagement increased. She spoke at town halls and rallies, becoming a voice for those who had been silenced. Then came an unexpected twist. Adrienne's attorney called her with news. The officers involved in her arrest were under investigation for misconduct in another case. Even more astonishing, Adrienne was assigned as the presiding judge for their hearing. The irony was staggering. For a moment, she considered recusing herself. But then she thought of the countless people depending on her. This isn't about revenge, she told herself. This is about justice. The courtroom buzzed with tension on the day of the hearing. Officer Carter and Officer Grant sat at the defense table, their usual confidence replaced by visible unease. When Adrienne entered the courtroom, donning her judge's robe, The shock on their faces was unmistakable. She addressed the room with the authority of her position. This court is now in session. The prosecutor presented a damning case. Witness testimony and body cam footage painted a grim picture of excessive force and abuse of power. Carter and Grant were called to testify. Carter stumbled through his answers, his confidence crumbling under Adrian's piercing gaze. Grant fared no better. "I thought the situation warranted force," he mumbled. "And do you still believe that now?" the prosecutor pressed. Grant hesitated, his eyes darting to Adrian. "No, I made a mistake." When it was time for closing arguments, the prosecutor's words resonated deeply. Law enforcement officers hold immense power. When they abuse that power, they betray the trust of the very people they are sworn to protect. This behavior cannot be tolerated. Adrian deliberated carefully. The next week, she delivered her ruling in a packed courtroom. "Officers Carter and Grant," she began, her voice steady, "the evidence presented leaves no doubt that your actions were unjustified and harmful. Law enforcement requires accountability, not just for the sake of justice, but to restore the public's trust." Her ruling was firm: suspension without pay, mandatory retraining, and a formal record of misconduct. As she struck the gavel to adjourn, Adrian glanced at the officers one last time. Their expressions were a mix of regret and resignation. Justice, she realized, was not about vengeance. It was about accountability and creating a future where moments like hers in the park would become relics of the past. For Adrienne, this was only the beginning of a larger fight, a fight she was ready to lead. See you in the next video. Take care. Goodbye.